about the evidence on control of corruption worldwide, on balance, the evidence is quite sobering. Control of corruption, on average around the world, according to all the data that we do gather and analyze, has not improved over the past 15 years. But there's enormous variation, and that's very good news, because it means that some countries show that yes, improvements are possible. But for any country that has improved, another country has deteriorated, and many have been muddling through. Now, corruption, I will suggest, is not the fundamental ill of it all. It's not the fundamental cause of all development, growth, social, and environmental ills. Instead, I think it's important to see it as an extremely costly and damaging symptom of institutional failure. And in many cases, as already mentioned in the opening speech, related to political institutions. So basically, the way of addressing corruption is not by fighting corruption, but another anti-corruption campaign, or just another law. We will revisit that later. Instead, anti-corruption ought to be seen more broadly and in terms of what the fundamental causes of corruption itself is, as hinted, and that lies in governance, in politics, accountability issues. The issues in civil societies is crucial, and that's where also ICT and its revolution, and related also to the power of data, comes in. In the case of natural resources, which I was requested to discuss, since our organization deals in particular with that challenge of governance in natural resources, that requires a very detailed and rigorous frameworks, because there are particular challenges and vulnerabilities which are specific to natural resources, and we'll review quickly some of them. In fact, natural resources ought to be seen much more broadly than just a very specific sectoral challenge. In many cases, and particularly for resource-rich countries and resource-dependent countries, it's a developmental challenge. It basically affects the whole economy and also the politics. Here we see very quickly some of the evidence about the sobering trend, which is quite flat. Both the blue line, which are top the red line, the blue line is basically the trend over time for control of corruption, the extent of control of corruption in countries which are not extractive intensive, or not very resource rich. And below it, because they have additional challenges, are the countries which are extractive intensive. Neither, on average, is doing very well, thank you very much. But in both cases, it's quite flat, and if anything, for extractive intensive countries, the trend is slightly negative. So we have a very sobering reality. Of course, these averages hide enormous variation. And this is a map of control of corruption. This comes from our governance database, the worldwide governance indicators. And this is roughly according to traffic light, just to visualize around the world between the countries that are most challenged in very deep red, to the very dark green, like in the Scandinavian countries or New Zealand, which are doing better, much better in terms of controlling corruption. And one sees a very varied picture. It's important to look and pause for a second and look at this type of worldwide map, because it begins to debunk some myths that basically all of corruption is in the South and in the developing countries, and all the rich countries, industrialized countries, are doing very well. That's not the case. Countries like Italy, Greece, have much higher levels of corruption than, I can proudly say, my own country, Chile, which shows as quite green, the long sliver in South America. Similarly, Botswana in Africa is doing significantly better than many countries in OECD, but not some others in Africa, as one can see. So there is significant variation even within a continent, and it is quite misleading sometimes to make generalizations about whole continents, as we see either with Latin America or with Africa, for instance. The other piece of relatively promising news that comes out from the data, the analysis, and the research that we have done over the years is that, yes, it can be done, so countries can do better in governance and anti-corruption. Unfortunately, that has not been the universal rule around the world, but there are dozens of countries that have improved over time. And associated with that improvement in controlling corruption, there is a very large development dividend. Countries that improve in controlling corruption in the long term can expect to triple their income per capita, going from $5,000 per year, for instance, to $15,000 per year. So it's a very significant dividend. And that development dividend applies as much or even more, as seen in this graph, for countries which are resource rich. So it's not the case, absolutely not the case, that if a country is very rich in resources, that can compensate for not having good governance and controlling corruption because they got the blessing of resources. To the contrary. So that's that also very important. What is at stake in natural resources in particular? The stakes are enormous nowadays. In resource-rich countries, there's over 1 billion people that live in poverty, at least less than $5 a day, and 2/3 of a billion living at $640 million dollars a day. So that's very, very sobering. In fact, and this is in large part because these resources are not very well managed. The resources are enormous. In Nigeria alone, oil revenues last year were 60% higher than all international aid to Africa. In fact, the rents from oil in the continent are about 8 to 10 times higher than foreign aid. So to put this in perspective, and that's in one continent alone. And natural resource revenue are expected to rise significantly further over the next decade, not only in Africa, but throughout the world, with the new discoveries, with the prices of commodities, and so on. So it's, in many respects, it's a development challenge of the generation. It is a challenge, but it's also in governance resides the potential solution. And that's why it's incredibly important using the tools of data and technology to try and assess, these countries in depth. What is the situation related to corruption and governance in natural resources? And this is something that we have done recently with issuing a report where we assess it and measure it for 58 different countries with specialized questionnaires and experts, 173 questions and so on. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through that in detail, but suggest that there are many different components to this index of the quality of resource governance. Let me see if it goes back to yes, so I can show it in the slides, which include the institutional and legal setting, to what extent there are good reporting practices, the safeguards and quality controls, and the enabling environment in terms of rule of law, control of corruption, voice democratic accountability, and so on. All this is measured with many different variables The slides I'm showing again is in the spirit of trust me, the very serious work took place over 2 years. And these are the type of results that come out. The sobering news is that over 80% of the countries which are rich in resources, relatively rich or very resource dependent, 58, which by the way, it includes India in the 58 also, about over 80% do not meet sufficiently satisfactory standards of governance in how natural resources are managed in the country. The good news is that there is a set of 10 to 12 countries which are green here, which do meet it and show that yes, it can be done. And those countries are by no means all rich and part of the fully industrialized old world. In fact, a number of Latin American countries are there. One has to, it's very important in this type of work not to rely only on aggregates and how the country is doing in one index only, but to disaggregate and see where are the vulnerabilities, that what it is done in this context. For the case of India, everything is in the Web 2. For every country, there is a country page. But just to illustrate, this is a page for India. It suggests that, yes, in terms of the composite score, it's doing relatively okay. It's a number 12 among the 58 countries with a score of 70. But there's a very significant variation, and the important thing is to focus on where, learn the lessons where it's doing really well. Everybody knows around the world, even I know, the transformative impact of the reforms related to the freedom of information law. Then that's one of the very green at top with a 100, very much in contrast with whether there is reporting on contracts related to the natural resources, where the rating is extremely low because there's no transparency and reporting on that. And then there are many other areas, some the rating well, others not so well. So basically, this may sound a little bit boring, but I think we think that there's no escape is doing the rigorous, in-depth analysis and seeing for every country, and this is just an illustration, what are the challenges and what are the gaps and what are the accomplishments, rather than relying on one country average that doesn't tell very much. In fact, going beyond this index, and this particular exercise, one of the things that we do in our organization is help with in-depth diagnostics for countries, which are not comparative one country to the other, but to go much deeper. In Nigeria, we did a case study some time ago, and there was a specific focus among others in trying to find out what are the main manifestations of corruption. And just to illustrate again the importance of going in depth in terms of mapping the different vulnerabilities, there were about 7 or 8 very particular types of corruption that arose throughout the value chain in the case of Nigeria, at the stage of giving awards for licenses, then in terms of contract negotiations, in terms of subcontracting, state-owned enterprises in extractive, particularly the national oil company. It's a huge issue in terms of misgovernance, mismanagement, and corruption. Public procurement, the revenue leakages and public expenditures. Then what's called bunkering, which is essentially theft of oil from the pipeline and other such ways. And then in the way that export and trading deals were structured in particularly opaque ways. So again, it shows that that one has to go beyond the traditional approach of looking whether a bribe was paid or not, and focus very specifically on all the value chain, and that was a case of corruption. So let's get now to the more practical part of what to do about corruption in natural resources. So there are enough tools to nowadays to try to assess the problem, to diagnose, to codify, and to measure. So let me provide a few thoughts for discussion. This is again based on international experience, what we have learned, and from our research and analysis, and it may or may not apply in the case of India, obviously. One area where we invested a lot, and we recently engineered a merger between two organizations, think tank NGOs, with a natural resource charter, because it's a very powerful intellectual product, which is called the Natural Resource Charter, that basically follows the whole value chain in a very methodical way. From the moment that the country decides or doesn't decide to take out the wealth from under the earth, the subsurface wealth, and how the question is how to convert that into prosperity. And it's extremely important then, very methodically, to go through the whole value chain. I hope you're seeing with me the slide from discovering the wealth. I don't know if there it is. Discovering the wealth, getting a good deal, managing the revenues, and then investing for development. The umbrella issues that are really important to stress throughout our value chain are related to governance, and therefore also to politics, the overarching issues of governance. The enabling international governance environment is equally important as well. And then within that value chain, one can then map and try to detect the various corruption vulnerabilities, like I just illustrated very quickly for Nigeria, where the licenses are given to inappropriate individuals at the time of discovering the oil or the copper mine or whatever other natural resource it is, whether they are environmental human rights abuses, preferential contract terms, tax evasion, crude, the mis-selling by the national oil company of crude oil, and that affects whether the country gets a good deal or not. And then in terms of managing revenues, the next stage, what's happening with the sovereign wealth funds? Is there malpractice there? Is there illicit flight of revenues? Are there budgetary leakages and misappropriations? Government officials getting personal gains, investment in chronic projects, and so on at the stage of using those resources. So there are plenty of those, and I think it's very important to recognize that those are very different manifestations of corruption that can come at different stages. And just focusing on a few, it means that the corruptor and the corruptee are going to look for other such opportunities of doing so. So then in terms of beginning to discuss what to do about it, something that will not surprise anybody in this among the eminent audience of the panelists is obviously transparency. But just to talk about transparency in very generic terms is not enough. Transparency has to be at every stage of the chain and very well carefully designed with a focus on details. It has to be comprehensive, whether in terms of the decision to extract or not, transparency there. If they're getting a good deal, the transparency about contracts is crucial, including the fiscal terms. That should be made public, ensuring revenue transparency, like now the international norms are tending to go in that direction, are crucial. The disclosure of financial data and savings, stabilization funds, investment funds, and so on is very important for managing the volatility that comes from natural resources. And then in terms of transparency and investing for sustainable development, how the extractive revenues are disposed, allocated, should be fully transparent. A lot of progress has been made in some countries, including in India, related to budgetary transparency. That's critical in this context, but not the only thing that matters. Another absolutely crucial issue is the behavior, as we already hinted with Nigeria, and the management or lack thereof of state-owned enterprises. This is a famous case of the Angola state-owned enterprise for oil, where $32 billion were misappropriated in just a few years. So it's the focus, and that's one of the areas we're focusing a lot these days on state-owned enterprises, and their reform is absolutely crucial in this context. Then very quickly, another absolutely crucial pillar for making progress in this area, in addition to the issue of transparency, the issue of state-owned enterprises, is basically the accountability that comes from providing a voice and the tools and the space to civil society to operate. And that obviously one of the great strengths that India has, as exemplified by the conference today, but there are so many countries nowadays which don't have the luxury of voice and democratic accountability like you enjoy in India nowadays. We see in this graph a very, very strong correlation between the extent of voice and democratic accountability on the one hand, and to what extent a country does well in governing and managing its natural resources, in particular from the Resource Governance Index. Similarly, we find a very strong and causal correlation between higher voice and democratic accountability on the one hand, and over time controlling corruption. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. The issue of technology is crucial, and it's a core part of your conference. So you know, and you're in Bangalore, so obviously you would know much more than I do, so I'll be brief on this, but since the role of technology is so crucial on also for governance and anti-corruption in natural resources, allow me just to say a few words on that. The technology is a major tool for enhancing transparency and accountability in national resource governance. Particularly, I like to mention the importance of leveraging the collection, analysis, and dissemination of data, such as the whole open data effort, open budgets, and related. The access and sharing of information, including on contracts in natural resources and in the operations of companies, and whether the operations are consistent with good environmental, human rights, and integrity standards. So technology can play an absolutely key role for monitoring. Then there are incredibly exciting advances in recent years, which you would know about it in terms of mapping of resources through satellite imaging technology, which are basically transforming the whole monitoring of natural resource use through these geographic information systems, combining mapping, statistical analysis, and database technology. I mentioned this not only because it's very exciting, but it also illustrates the point that technology is an incredibly important tool, but it cannot be applied mechanistically and alone only by the tech experts. Just like the subject matter experts cannot do this alone, but there's an interface between the context, the experts, the data analysis, very smart data analysis, and the technological tools that can make the difference and have a multiplier effect, rather than any of us operating in silos and alone. And that's another reason of welcoming so much the initiative of this conference. And last, but certainly not least, and it was mentioning at the beginning, and it's again a reason for the conference, as I understand it, technology is incredibly important for mobilizing participatory civil society, for spurring and abetting collective action in this field. So let me end in sum in terms of some of the main points of what to do about corruption in natural resources, which may be particularly important, without doing full justice to them or to other things I may have left out. One is to look at the issue from a comprehensive governance framework standpoint and not just as an isolated corruption scandal. And that's why looking at the whole value chain and decision-making chain from extraction, the decision to extract until the use of resources for development is very important. And that's where the Natural Resource Charter framework as a diagnostic tool and for benchmarking, which we are applying at the request of a number of governments and civil society in a number of countries already, is very important. Then related to that, there is no escape of doing an in-depth country diagnostic of the country. Every country is different, will have its own context and specificity through the benchmarking via the charter, as well as the resource governance index, which I showed before. And associated with that, there has to be an understanding of the political economy, including the politics of capture from the elite, which are an incredibly important feature in many countries, and of which other participants and panelists here, like Larry Diamond, would know much more, so I will say little at this point. Third, I don't have to say more, transparency is incredibly important, and we already illustrated it in the value chain. Accountability and collective action, civil society, but working also with parliament, with the reformers in government, but that's why we call it collective action is very important and not in an isolated fashion. Leveraging the power of technology and data is absolutely crucial, and marrying smartly both data with technology. Sometimes, because it's more boring, we do not put sufficient emphasis that it's really important at the end of the day to have effective policy making. Particularly the serious technocrats, reformers in government play an incredibly important role. It's not all about civil society or outside of government. And having a lot of accountability and civil society participation without effective policy making at the end of the day does not deliver the goods. So we need to keep that in mind, including on issues of the budget, also in terms of institutional innovations. And that's where they are very interesting ones, like giving cash transfers coming from oil receipts, which Larry Diamond and others have written about, and so on. And then just before the last and finishing, focusing from the diagnostic on those most vulnerable institutions which are identified, it's crucial. And that's why I keep coming back to state-owned enterprises, which are a particularly vulnerable point in a number of countries nowadays, but also some of the multinational corporations, particularly in oil. In mining, they're behaving a little better, but some in oil, they're still engaged in very opaque practices. Not all, but some. So there has to be also a sea change in that multinational scene, and that's why the global reforms regarding mandatory disclosure that are being mandated now, although under litigation in the US, but also now in the EU and Canada, hopefully very soon, are very important. In fact, I end with that. There's a global responsibility here too. It's not all up to the country. The adoption of international standards and global initiatives, including what I just mentioned, the mandatory disclosure, but also the adoption and joining the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, or EITI, as well as the Open Government Partnerships. Those are extremely important also international initiatives in this context that need to complement the country-specific approach.